When I got diagnosed when I was in the 4th grade, it was just like, okay, you have a cold or a cough. It didn't register beyond that because you're a kid.
Like we never sort of had any label around, oh, ye learning disability hai, ye hai, ye hai, ye hai. But as a parent, you get very, very involved and concerned, and how do you sort of set that back so that you protect the child but don't cripple just the child, right?
Problem is everybody looks at dyslexia or any sort of SLD as a thing they have to deal with independently. It has to be solved outside the current ecosystem.
The moment you give them that language, कि ये बच्चा कोशिश कर रहा है but नहीं कर पा रहा है, it changes mindsets. Like now you have teachers saying यार आप अगर पहले आ जाते तो मैं ये सब लोगों का बदल देती. One is our focus is on an individual's life journey from cradle to career.
She's the thought leader, she's the brain, she's the passion behind it in that sense. Because she's seen me go through it and now she's seeing her daughter go through it in this sense, right?
You know, while we were growing up, we really never sort of thought about learning disability or any of that, right? Yeah. Like we were growing up as siblings, we knew that like he was probably not academically as bright as I was. I think there was always that comparison in terms of how it was grades and stuff. And it wasn't, for me at least, till much later that we realized that that's something like a learning disability and the label that came in. I think it's always been sort of part of our life, and I think that's probably better that you sort of talk about something.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, when I got diagnosed when I was in the 4th grade, it was just like, okay, you have a cold or a cough. It didn't register beyond that because you're a kid. And we were just told, ki, Acha, now you will sort of sit separately and study, plus you'll be with the class and you'll have, different exam papers and test papers and whatever else. But it never sunk in that it's such a big problem or such a big thing that exists in this world that none of us ever acknowledged.
Right.
I think that's what really made, that's when it first sunk in a sense, right? And now I just laugh about it knowing that in the 5th grade I couldn't spell my name. I didn't know my ABCDs.
And I think like also our school environment sort of helped with it, right? Like we're not one of those very academically inclined schools.
Correct.
Very thorough in knowledge creation, right? And there was a lot of space to excel outside of things.
Yeah, it was definitely not a formal school in that sense, right? It was, 25 people a class.
Yeah.
So it was a small school. Everybody knew everyone, everybody knew everybody's issues, everybody knew everybody's successes in a sense, right? It was more personal than a regular school would be from my context. And I think that helped a lot. But I think the school played a very pivotal role in one, identifying dyslexia, which is what I suffered with, or I deal with. And I think just the ecosystem helped a lot. There was no sort of hang up, oh, he's failing in his grades, or, he needs to buckle up or they will fail you in the class. I think the school ecosystem, having Gigi there, having, mom involved a whole lot in that ecosystem helped. And the teachers being a lot more supportive than anything else. It was very personal in that sense, so it worked well.
I think what was beautiful about it is, like he was saying, it was like another cough, right? Like we never sort of had any label around, oh, ye learning disability hai, ye hai, ye hai, ye hai. So it was, everybody was looked at from a point of strength and different qualities. I think if I were to come out of school, right, and we grew up in a different time, right? We had building friends and you had like family friends and then you had school friends. And like everywhere else, the dynamic was different. And for some reason, academic performance at that point was really not a measure of anything.
No, it was important, but it was not what it is today.
Yeah.
Right? Obviously, you had to excel, and that was an expectation. But the pressure that exists today is very different from then, right? I think what also helped in the school was the fact that it was not just me that got identified. There were 3 other boys in my class who got identified. So out of class of 20, 26, 28 of us, if I remember correctly, we were 4 of us who got identified as dyslexia at various levels of dyslexia. So I think that sort of also blunted the taboo, if you want to call it that, in a way. And it was, honestly, it was detected just by accident. It was not like the school was actively looking out for something like this. It was, we had a counselor in school who saw our grades in a certain fashion, saw our test papers in a certain fashion, and she said, look, there seems to be signs of this. And however, God bless that lady, but however she figured out that this existed, she called mom, dad to school and said, you should get him tested because it seems like he's suffering from dyslexia. And then we've never looked back ever since, right? So it was just incidental, and it was not just me. So that sort of helped in the ecosystem.
Also, I want to say, like, we come from a traditionally
Very
a middle class Marwadi academic achiever sort of family. Everybody was really smart. Lots of accountants in the family. Lots of people who've cleared maybe government exams. All of it.
Yeah.
And
Excel tremendously.
Excel, in the traditional pathways. And if you look at my dad's family, from the cousins, we were never on the top of the list, right?
Yeah.
We were one of those kids, I think, who went to the...
I was one of the kids. You still excelled. So let's not discount yourself there. But yeah.
In the sense that, we didn't go through that academic rigor like all our cousins. And at the grandparents level, sometimes there was that comparison ki padhai nahi kar rahe hain, they're too involved in other things in life. Naukri kaise milegi, college kaise jayegi. For my case, it was also came from patriarchal, right? Like taller girl, all of that. So it was like, okay, nahi kar rahi hai padhai, doesn't matter, sort of bit. But for him, I think that pressure was there. But there were certain, I think, turning points, because as a family also, we're a very opinionated family, right? And there was a lot of space to sort of discuss knowledge and not academics.
That is
so
true.
Lots of debates, what's going around in the world, where do we see things happening, lots of passionate fights. I think half our conversations used to end with, let's agree to disagree. So the issue was never the learning disability. The
Correct.
issue always was dynamics of the parent, child, grandparent, grandchild, sibling, cousins, which I think would happen in any family. And very subtly, I think in the background, the family sort of creating, and I think spearheaded by my parents.
Yeah, and come to think of it, I don't ever remember anybody in the family saying, ये तो failure है, ये कुछ नहीं करेगा अपने life में. I don't remember anybody ever saying it.
I think mummy's threat on us was always the case, which was different. For me, it was...
Mom is different thing. Babaji, Dada,
Yeah,
Chacha,
absolutely.
Chachi, Buas. Nobody ever said or compared me to their kids. Not in front of me.
Correct.
They might be doing it in the background, jo bhi ho, but in front of me, I was never told कि यार तू बेवकूफ है.
It was not an issue. मतलब it was never in terms of, at least I don't remember, it was like tuition जाते हैं बच्चे, ये भी जा रहा है. I was going for dance class, he was going for some class. We actually never knew.
Yeah, and I think part of it was because it was, dyslexia is not an easy word to say or identify or recognize, right? It's got its own sort of loaded word, complicated feeling है उसमें. तो a lot of people, हाँ कुछ होगा यार, वो ठीक है, क्लास जा रहे ठीक हो जाएगा. वैसे ही चलता है टाइप में वो निकल गई बात. But people who knew it, right? Who understood it, did what they could to soften the issues that come with it. But I think the larger family just said, हाँ ठीक है, कुछ तो है अभी, ठीक है ना, figure out हो जाएगा, कर रहा है जो.
And honestly, that time life was so busy, I don't think anybody had the time to dwell. Really, I think we lived in joint families, there weren't resources, there were so many things that a person had to juggle with, that you sort of never worried about things that were this critical. Actually, it was not even critical, it's like part of growing up. But I think this also helped, because while our parents weren't involved in our padhai, and I'll tell you that was a blessing that our parents weren't involved in our padhai, but our friends were, and friends' parents, and I think that sort of help us keep track of many things, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't think if we would have been, you would be able to study without Hansa auntie
No,
and
no, not at all.
Harshi
Not at all.
coming in,
Not at
right?
all. Again, it was an ecosystem thing, right?
Yeah.
Because we were a small class, we all were pretty close to each other. We would go to each other's house unannounced. It was like being building friends, but they're actually class, school friends in that sense. So Bombay is a big city, in that sense, but we still live the small city life in a way, right? A lot of my friends' parents taught me a lot of things I didn't know. My best friend's mom spent more time teaching me than teaching her own son, in a sense, right? And that's Hansanti. Uh, that just, honestly, I think the whole journey has been incredibly blessed in that sense. How do you replicate this? I don't know.
But then came computers, and I think that was sort of a turning point, right? So, for some reason, my family believed that I should have a computer. I think Chacha gifted it to us, right? It was my 13th entry in teenage world, and that, like all good things that happen in a middle class family, it was kept in a showcase, a wooden showcase, covered nicely, and never
Yeah.
sort of used. And at one point, somebody said कि इतना पैसा खरीद कर एक computer दिया है showpiece के लिए नहीं, somebody needs to use it. And I couldn't sort of figure out how to do it. And this little chut, right, he's like 4 years younger than me, so he must have been what, 8, 9
Yeah, probably.
years old. He gets fascinated by this device, right? And then
Yeah, and that was a turning point for me, is because that's something that I really excelled at. That really drove my curiosity, and I was able to think like it in a way, right? It's like it's like fish to water in that sense. And I haven't looked back again ever since. Continue to be a avid technologist at heart. Don't understand some of the new technologies coming out, but the passion is still there, and it's still driving a lot of the decisioning that we do today. But yeah, the computer was an eventful thing in our lives once it showed up. Then going down and playing didn't matter. It was about being on the computer.
computer programming all the time, and the running joke was कि इसकी girlfriend हमेशा robot
You
होगी.
robot hogi. That is
You know,
true.
like that was sort of the thing. And what was amazing to me is like, I was this traditional sort of padhai karo, and I wanted to go abroad, I wanted to go to university, whatever, get a degree, sort of traditional pathway. I wanted to do psychology, economics, all of this. And this boy was just like, I will do computers, and nobody knew that there were even career pathways in that. And he started sort of failing school exams, almost like you can't fail in our school, you really need to be very, very absent to fail. So, like bottom of the class sort of thing. But at the same time, like doing all this, you did what, Cisco?
I did the CCNA, the Cisco certification, when I was in, I think, 8th grade, one of the youngest at that point of time to do it. I was doing programming that she was doing in the 10th, I was doing in the 6th. In that sense, there was, like, the computer was just a different world for me. I was not the same individual that normally was in class. And people started identifying it, and they started realizing कि यार इसको math नहीं आएगा, but इसको computer आ जाएगा. English मत पूछो, computer के बारे में जो भी करना है पूछ लो. But I think that was really the.
But I want to call out Papa here, because what he did is, right, like he allowed and enabled that environment where he could spend that time and sort of do the certification. Then you started some magazine, and you started making websites, I think, where he registered a company.
Correct.
जिसमें you
Correct.
could earn.
No, so I think a lot of credit goes to Dad in this, from the sense is, the traditional Indian thinking is कि the son will continue the family business or the
Correct.
family practice. I can't remember ever, right, Dad telling me, "Beta, देखो chartered accountant बनना है." Right? You have to do that exam. You have to study for it. कोशिश कर ले. Who is going to continue the family business? I think he's always just left me to figure out my life on my own. And mom has always been the cheerleader in that sense, right? Gigi and mommy were always the cheerleaders. Dad was always hands off to let me figure out what I want. And I think that's allowed me to kind of figure out my path without the pressure, right? And I think that's helped significantly. I think that defines a lot of who I am today and how I look at life, right? And to an extent, I feel spoiled.
But of course, you are spoiled and a brat as well, even at this age. But, you know, as a family, like I was saying, I don't know if you remember, but at one point the elders decided that it would be cool to expose us to startups that as a family they were looking to invest in. Right? So there was like one tower company, and then there was somebody who's doing healthcare, tech, all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And like, really, we didn't want to be in that room. It was all of us cousins. I was, I think, in the 11th or 12th.
Yeah.
But this fellow was sitting there, right? And I remember so clearly that there was some company that came in. This is pre-mobile, right? कि हम towers करेंगे, and you know there was this debate कि total phone coverage कुछ है, and there's only so much. Even BSNL or MTNL, whatever it was at that point, was not making money. Mobile कौन खरीदेगा? Chochle. And this little fellow stood up, and the men in my family are a bit towering, right? Like you really cannot talk to them, and you cannot talk to them if you don't know your stuff, right? And he stood up and said कि, you know, like, I don't think this is the right space. You should be investing in data centers. Because like you don't get it, everybody's making websites, सब कुछ cloud में जाएगा, ultimately data is going to be king. And I think that was...
I still reflect on that business plan today. You know, it was one of the many ideas I was very passionate about. But I think had we done that, life would have been very different again. And this is what dyslexia helps you with, right? Is to think things differently.
I think for me as a sibling, right? Like even though as a child, when you're growing up together, you don't realize these things, right? But for me, it has always been कि ये कीड़ा है. Like Papa is a कीड़ा, Chacha is a कीड़ा, and like the way they think is non-traditional. And to get that perspective, and over a period of time, trusting that opinion. So I will never go to him about like... If I were to look at advice, I'll never ever go to him कि मेरे को यहाँ पर खर्चा करना है, या you know how. Whenever I'm thinking of something not straight-jacketed, like that's how our relationship is. Like we brainstorm and sort of ideate together. I think my memory of my brother is that he has all these ambitious plans and ideas which kept getting shot down like by the family, and us sort of figuring out कि यार ये convince कैसे करें.
Correct.
कि this is viable, doable, and I'm capable to do it. It was a turning point for me, like when my youngest was born, Nitya was born.
With Nitya, it was not an incidental diagnosis.
Yes, that's right.
It was a purposeful diagnosis.
Correct.
It is something we went out to identify because we saw signs that I went through.
Correct.
I think that's what makes the difference. For me, it was just ho gaya, and for Nitya, she's making the same mistakes, you know, Kunal did.
I think that's fair, and also we started the interventions for Nitya. I started it much earlier. So while she was in upper KG and first standard, I realized quickly that she was not picking up the language skills that she should be. I was a working parent. I've always been a working parent. So I didn't have the time, so I got a teacher who we called the tuition teacher at that point for her to come in. And a lot of people told me like, ये क्या पागलपन है? Like, who gives a first standard child tuitions? Like, you are really a crazy mother. But for me, it was that discipline that I had seen that helped him, right? The constant need to study regularly, to be able to move. And then to speak to that teacher and say, look, I don't know if it'll happen. I'm seeing signs. Let's try and tackle it. The teacher's coming back and telling me कि देखते क्या होगा, right? This is outside the home, not in the school. And the school giving me contra views, like, no, it's none of that. You're sort of overthinking all of that. And then that culminating on the third standard, for a formal diagnosis, which was more, like he said, not incidental, but intentional. And bringing that brought its own sets of challenges, right? Because now it became a challenge from a perspective of the label. Whereas in his case, that label never existed. So it was a blessing in disguise.
Correct.
Whereas in our case, it is a label that while my child wears proudly and we wear proudly as a family, around us,
people look at us
it's
differently.
not. I think seeing this from a sibling's perspective versus seeing this from a perspective of a parent, very, very different. Right? Like as a sibling, you don't sort of think about it, and whatever, if you're being an ass, you don't care whether it's dyslexia or something else, you like whack the person, right?
Yeah.
Or you'll have the argument and whatever else it is. But as a parent, you get very, very involved and concerned, and how do you sort of set that back so that you protect the child but don't cripple just the child, right? When we went through Nitya's sort of detection and that bit, so of course there's a lot of like ye wo with the school. It's a larger school, didn't have as much of an environment that we're used to. It was as close to the environment that we could be growing up with. And then when Nitya got this diagnosis, like one of the first things she did was pick up the phone and tell Mama, Mama, I'm like you. Like, it's so cool, right? Like, you and me are matching. And I think that keeps her going to a certain extent, right? Like, even today, like, often she will say, like, okay, I'm not talking to you, I'm going to talk to Mama. Like, because, and that, in a sense, with our family, has created that acceptance. If we were to look at sort of the journey, right? At that point, professionally, we had taken different pathways, right? Like, he had a startup at that point. He's always been the type of kid who's wanted to start a business. But my family's always said, hold your horses, get the discipline first. Idea se company nahi chalti hai.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
And I think he realized this when he started doing his internships.
Yeah.
Do you remember your first internship when you had to go to Fort Smith?
Yeah.
We both studied abroad. He wanted to come back and start a business. Our family refused.
Yeah. I was pretty much thrown out of the house when I said I don't want to go to the US to study. So I wanted to come back as quickly as I could. And eventually it came to वहाँ पर नौकरी कर लो, पढ़ाई करिए तो सीख लो कुछ और. But that was character building in a sense, right? I think a lot of that defined how I am today and how I work today.
So I think that discipline, then seeing him like establish a company, like seeing my family sort of gave me the confidence of being able to start an enterprise myself. And then to transition from being a professional to the entrepreneurship, right? I've always been a traditional naukri karo, salary low sort of thing. I was working in the government at that point. I was working in education, and bang, I realized that, boss, there's lots more to this than this sort of bubble that our parents and that we came from. So it was that. And I think one is to solve problems for ourselves, right? But I think the culture of not accepting things for what they are and what they ought to be, and working towards that in whatever capacity you can, is something that was sort of bred into us. I think there were a couple of things from our perspective, right? Like, my parents forced us to get relevant experience to be able to run organizations on our own. It's very different when you're chasing a bottom line, and very different when you're trying to get on a task where you have taken on the responsibility of impacting somebody, right? Up until now, for me, I was like supporting my brother as an older sister, so it didn't make a difference. What is the worst that will happen? I'll screw up my brother, right? Like, usse bura kya hoga? Life mein, and usme bhi like papa, mummy are around, the family is there, so there are enough barriers. I'm not the only sort of support bit. Then it comes to your child, and you're like, oh crap, now this is getting serious. Like, you know, now I am responsible for this.
I'll have to deal with it all on my own.
All on my own, and I have the repercussions of it, right? And then you sort of start thinking ki, okay, let me sort of work with, because you're in a position that you can. So I started working as a parent advocate and like as a person in the system who could jahan par kuch kare. And then that, you know, that turning point where you sit and reflect, like, is it time to start? And when I'm not sure of something that I can or cannot do, my first phone call is him. To get him to convince me कि ऐसे हो सकता है, and to take away all that sort of anxiety and the pressure. कि दीदी क्या होएगा यार? At the most it will not work. But for me that doesn't work, right? Like, I am this person that अगर 2 साल के बाद बंद हो गया, then it's a failure. And the ability and the resilience to take each day as it come, but keep sort of track of the overall vision. And that's when we sort of decided to do it together.
But I think that's where ChangeInkk makes the difference, right? She's the thought leader, she's the brain, she's the passion behind it in a sense. Because she's seen me go through it and now she's seeing her daughter go through it in the sense, right? And she understands how to articulate what needs to be done and work at a policy level and things like that, right? The impact is far more significant. Versus me, where I am the oddball, like my niece, and we will find the most atrangi way of doing something. Even if there is a straight way of doing it, we'll find the atrangi way to do it, right? And I think that's what makes the difference. And I think that's why ChangeInkk is able to make the impact that it is, because right now in its journey, it is making that policy impact that it needs to make, right? And I think that's where the change will really happen.
So the other thing we were seeing is like a lot of the mums had started remedial centers or inclusive schools, right? That was the journey. They quit their professional life, kids didn't get support. And then I saw my parents that nothing shifted in their lives because of this disability, right? Like mom continued to do what she had to, my father continued, and we sort of continued. And that perspective told me that, yeah, I don't want to start a school. Why should I do something outside what I'm trained to do professionally? कि यार अगर कुछ करना है sustainably for people to get the privilege that we have lived, right? System को बदलना होगा.
Yeah, and truly to not make it an exception. The problem is everybody looks at dyslexia or any sort of SLD as a thing they have to deal with independently. It has to be solved outside the current ecosystem. I think the biggest thing that ChangeInkk and the intent behind it is to say, no, it doesn't have to be solved outside the ecosystem. It has to become part of the ecosystem.
Exactly.
Right? And you see, historically, these changes have always taken time to come, but they eventually come. Whether it is, girls and boys going to school together, first whether girls going to school at all is
Correct.
relevant or not. Then whether girls and boys can go to school together or not. Then whether they can study English or not, or whatever it might be, right? Everything has taken its journey from a societal point of view. And I think that's the journey that we're going through right now, from dealing with exceptions, as we call it, and realizing that these are actually not exceptions. The large portion of our population is actually in the SLD space, right? In a way. And how do we encourage them to do better, or how do we create an environment within the existing ecosystem for it to work? I think that's the biggest change in that sense that we're looking.
Yeah, and like this chota bubble of ours, right? Like in Bombay, in a small school, 300 kids, everybody supportive. It's like, it's a magical world that we grew up in.
Truly.
Which was, for us, a reality. Could not believe that the world could be another way. Which sort of burst with the reality of everyone else. And this attempt that how do you expand this bubble to cover this education space where money and where you're born should not determine how well you do in life, because you're born a certain way, right? And how do you change that system to normalize that and empower? And I think a lot of times that the frustration I feel with other parents is that this constant fight with the system. बच्चे से ज़्यादा झगड़ा है कि सिस्टम को कैसे ठीक करें हम लोग, राइट? इसको कैसे सॉल्व करें? And you're fighting door to door, and I think that needs to stop. And I think from that perspective, we started this with a very clear mindset कि यार हम स्कूल में इंटरवेंशन नहीं करेंगे. And at the back of my head, it was always one thing that, yes, the family does a lot of charity and all of it. But it's weird that growing up, it used to annoy me. As an adult, it's become a form of identity. One is, छोटा काम मत करो, बड़ा सोचो, right? Like, and बड़ा not कि कितना पैसा, कितने लोग, all of that. बड़ा means बड़ा impact. Like, don't confine yourself to space. That push to get changing, to be able to create that impact through leverage, right? Do the multiplier effect, create those ripples, start the fire, whatever you may call it, sort of bit. but do it in a grounded, realistic way. Don't chase the low hanging fruits alone.
Don't be, for lack of better, don't be foo-foo about it.
Correct.
Be a realist. You want to make an impact, you have to start small in anything you start with, but make sure you know the path to make a big impact, right? And be absolutely honest about it, right? Call out when you made a mistake, call out when you've done successfully. But and I think that's what again makes a very large difference. A lot of people get caught up in passion, but honestly, passion only gets you so far.
Yeah.
It's also about execution on ground.
Then that, as a person who goes into the details, to get entangled in the छोटा बात, स्कूल में टीचर नहीं है, जब टीचर ही ट्रेन नहीं है तो कैसे होगा, right?
Yeah.
And to keep zooming back, that voice at the back, बड़ा सोचो, don't look at the big picture, right? Like how are you going to sort of look at that bit? Sort of helps build some of that. His experiences of setting up his own company to bring in that structure. Like when we started in COVID, we started post-COVID, right? We were a team of three, four, we started with 2 people, then first it was all me. Then it was somewhere somebody realized that the brother is also powering, so it was us. Then we got our first colleague who came in. Then there was a bunch of young, really enthu kids. So I think the first person who signed a contract, we did recruitment on Ashoka campus. And this girl agreed.
Now you're turning into an organization.
Now we're turning. So that was sort of a turning, okay, what we are trying to do is accomplishing something. Then we became a team of 9 or 10 people, really dynamically working. Everybody's working from home. You're working like a family again. It's a small enterprise. In the background, you have the TCF and Ashish Dhawan, who's powering us, right? One of the critiques I got is ChangeInkk is all Noopur. It's all your passion, but Noopur, what happens when you're not there? And I'm like, where am I going? And the worst thing for an entrepreneur to hear it in the beginning, but that constant push ki look beyond what you can do and create that system. We're now a team of 31, we're across 6 states, all pushing the agenda to act for dyslexia. I think I want to step back a little bit here and I want to sort of look at one of the things that I learned as Nitya was growing up, and then we were also growing up, and we had transitioned from being in school, college to becoming independent professionals in our own regard. And I started seeing that this is not a school-related problem, right? I could see you still struggle with certain things. Like one of the most frustrating things was that when is he going to arrive by flight? Like dates were confused, wrong flights were booked. I think one of the pet peeves was the amount of flights that were cancelled and rebooked.
Yeah, I would reverse the flights. Instead of flying Bombay-Delhi, I would book Delhi-Bombay. Just all sorts of goofy things.
Yeah, and you realize then at some point that this is never going to end.
Yeah, that's just the nature of the beast. You don't ever get rid of this. Dyslexia is not something that you just, acha, you've gone to class, you've learned something new and you've solved for it. That's not what dyslexia is. It's how do you manage it is the key to it. And to that point, it still bugs me. But that's
it was this, and then the other thing, as a kid, I was the bookworm. I used to be avid reader, and he never read. And as an adult, I think it's frustrating because now that has changed.
Correct.
And I think now you do those audiobooks when you commute.
Correct.
Right? So now he has more books than I do, and he's reading a lot more, and very frustrating as a sibling who used to be on the upper hand on this. To realize that things shift.
Yeah.
Right? Just because you've lagged somewhere behind. And I think that transition to adulthood, which most people don't talk about, right? Because your role when you're a kid changes, then you're a student, then you're in college, then your first job dealing with your manager, especially when you have a manager who's more straitjacketed than you, lots of conversations around, yaar, isko to samajh mein nahi aata, isko naukri kisne di? This is so basic.
Yeah, and again, it is that, मैं 10 स्टेप में क्यों करूं जब मैं 2 स्टेप में कर सकता हूं? It's यार but destination एक ही है, मैं आसानी से पहुंच रहा हूँ, तो why should I take this
Correct.
long complicated journey when it's not needed? You know, I already know the solution. इतना बेवकूफ है क्या वो? In that sense, right? But they're not. It's the journey that they've gone through. It's what they know as the way to do something. And then you have your own way. What got me really stuck was, you know, I've had a couple of, honestly, I can think on one hand how many jobs I've had professionally. And in all of those, I've never had one boss. I've had 3 or 4 bosses. Because by the nature of what I did, I would report into my immediate boss, then I would report into his boss, and then his boss, and then some other random person, right? Because everybody else would give me work, and I would, you know, sort of, I was very excited about working. So, jitna mila wo kara. I was never a straightforward employee, you know, and to me, that is another example of how dyslexics are. We're not straitjacketed. We are very, very different. We don't have a problem dealing with multiple people, multiple levels, multiple. It's just, हमें काम करने दो यार. हमें let us live our lives.
And I think that environment where the family recognizes, I think now that I see as parents, we are often stuck. We are stuck in the security of the boundaries or the lines that we are grown up to think about. And then you have this kid who becomes like a problem child, right? Like never listening to anybody. खुद का कर रहा है, अपने आप को बड़ा अक्लवदी समझता है. And then sometimes what happens is when you're taking these risks, you fail, boss. You will fall flat on your face, and
how?
sometimes systems will fail. You know, you will not have a job. You will have a fight with the boss.
You'll get
or
fired.
You'll get fired. You're trying to get a new job. You're not getting
Yeah.
it. You're trying to do the exam. You want to study a subject that you love, but you know, academically you're not going to do well in it. But you're sort of growing up, and this, as a parent and as a family, is a constant sense of fear. Ki, how do I deal when this child fails? Right? That's one. The other is like your life mission is to prevent the child from failing. I have to, like, I can't emphasize this enough. At no point that the family say, oh, bichara, you know what, agar itna kar liya to theek hai. Standards were never lowered.
Yeah.
Expectations were never lowered. Right? You were always expected to work hard.
Yeah.
You were expected to not just give your best, but give beyond your best. You were always pushed to think bigger picture.
Correct.
Right? Even if you had a niche that you wanted to work with, you were supposed to know what the bigger picture is.
Correct.
And understand how your niche works in that bigger picture.
You had to grow.
You had to constantly grow.
And you had to constantly, were, even if, for example, even with my dyslexia, I would not be the first 3 students of the class academically. It didn't mean I should not aspire to be those.
Correct.
Right? It was never discounted, tu nahi kar payega, chhod de. You know, it was never, again, there was never this ki tu nahi kar raha, tu bekoof hai, or tu nahi kar payega, chhod de. You know, it was never, either of those two never existed as conversations. It was always, yaar, karna, we'll see what happens. Pehle kar to sahi. Give it your best. Yeah? You never know, it might come out on top. How do you know? Right? I think the benefit of doubt is where the real value creation happens.
Yes.
And encouragement of trying is where the value creation really happened.
And we started seeing that this did not exist in the world outside of our world. Right? So when we came in with ChangeInkk, I think often people ask me that why are you taking so much stress? You know, like, apna kaam karo, let the child go, yeah, like all other nice parents sort of sit at home, teach her, you know, focus. What is this bit? And I think that sort of came from there where we sort of realized ki we are not going to do things that other people can do. Right? Like, between him and me, we're not educated, so we are not going to be able to build an inclusive school and fund it and run it. But we have the ability and vision that if inclusive schools are to exist, what does it take? And how can we as individuals who have come from that privilege and that bubble enable that to make it happen? And you know, by God's grace, one of the things that we are lucky about is that when you sort of manifest it, people come together, and very quickly we realize that our success was not, or whatever little you can call a success, like I don't want to like our whatever we've achieved in life has come not because we went to a special space. We went to a mainstream school, we worked with mainstream people,
Yeah.
we had an environment that was inclusive by nature, right? That's where success lay. And the world is overarchingly becoming polarized.
Yeah.
Right? Special school, you're disabled, you're a girl, you're this, you're that, you're that. Iske liye ye karo. And that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right? That's not where you come from, though that's not where your identity comes from. And I think changing is trying to do that. Look at the bigger picture. Address those challenges from a bigger picture perspective. Work with the ecosystem. So that ecosystem could be like a special educator working in a basti, right? Connected to a school. It could be an employer. Ultimately, like, why did Kunal succeed? Where did he get that experience? His bosses didn't know that he had a learning disability, but they appreciated his mind and tolerated his quirks,
Yeah.
right? And this was not that they were given sensitized
Yeah.
training, all of that bit. Of course, if they had been given, his life would have probably been a lot easier.
Yeah.
But now that we've come out of it and sort of speak about it, they realize there's a lot of reflection
Correct.
in that bit. So you realize, okay, workplace is a thing. Then you realize ki, okay, how college sort of played a role. And you create that environment of holistically speaking. In fact, when we started changing, if you remember, we had this conversation कि school में काम करना है कि बाहर.
Yeah.
And we were very clear कि school में नहीं करना है. Like the first team was given कि education vertical पे हम काम नहीं करेंगे.
Because पे लोग काम कर रहे
हैं यार.
And today, I'm dyslexic. I run a company, right? I'm an employer in that sense. But it's difficult for me to hire people with SLDs. Because either one, people don't want to talk about their SLDs, or two, they don't get filtered through the system. And I'm still struggling. We've done enough workshops,
yeah.
right? Talking to people, both academia and professional, about how to hire these people. The academia is saying, yes, we have these kids. And I've said, please send me their resumes. I want to hire these people because I know how incredible these people can be. But I haven't heard anything. So there is a taboo within a taboo within a taboo. It's very strange, when you have somebody who's willing to listen, but you're not willing to share. I think that's the biggest thing that we're trying to break, and that's why schools have what they're doing, but I don't think schools is where the problem is at this point of time. That will get solved with the larger sort of educational policy stuff that's going on. I think the bigger impact is how do we solve that kid in the 12th grade or the graduate who's getting into the workforce today, is how do we make a difference to that individual, right? And we hear a lot of these unique individual stories, but there has to be a point where they're not unique stories.
Correct.
They're just the way it is. There is not a Steve Jobs that made Apple who it made. There are 600 Steve Jobs around, right? And then that's what the objective is to normalize, which should be normal in any case.
Correct. And the other thing that I've learned is that when people understand, and not just understand what the challenge is, but also understand how they should handle it, right? Like we were lucky that we were educated about it in a very subtle, non-threatening, non-labeling fashion. The resistance falls down, right? Like I have found very few teachers or employers who intentionally will say, I will not hire this person, right? There are very few. It almost always comes from a stereotype or a bias of not knowing. So you're handling them because you're overworked, whatever. And that shift in like the thought process comes from the awareness. Like when we started about 3 years ago, nobody knew what dyslexia was, right? अच्छा ठीक है हो जाएगा, like अच्छा तुमको करना है ना, अच्छा ऐसे, like it was like on the borderline. You don't want to sort of say no because it has to be done, but at the same time you don't want to make it mainstream. And over a period of time that the team has been working, we've been conversing, we've done lots of trainings, lots of sensitization. You have an ecosystem that is built out. We have over, I would say, 100 organizations in India. And then, you have this Indian perspective and you say, यार ये तो इंडिया का प्रॉब्लम है. You don't know UK, यूरोप एंड US में तो बहुत काम हो रहा है. एंड हम लोग पता नहीं क्या कर रहे हैं, इसीलिए सारे बच्चे कंट्री छोड़ के जा रहे हैं. But the truth is, they've also not figured out the answer. Like, it's a fallacy to believe, because like we're working with some people in the UK, we're working with partners in the US, and they are also trying to. It's very, like, the knowledge around this is also evolving. Of course, they have more systematics. Let me say this. From a policy regulation point of view, India is at par globally. But from a policy action point of view, the implementation and sort of getting there, that's where the challenge is.
The scale is different in India.
Yeah. Also, I think the West, it's based on compliance. Ki if you don't do it, you'll get fined, you'll get jailed, you'll get sued, whatever else it is. In India, that framework is still thoda sa kacha pakka sort of thing. But we've, at least our learning as a team, going into the field, has been like suddenly people have realized that it's solving a problem that I did not know exists, right? Like a child who's not going to learn no matter what exists in the classroom, right? No teacher is going to. Abhi the teacher is like banging their head on the wall trying to solve for this child.
Yeah.
And getting frustrated, the child is not able. The moment you give them that language, कि ये बच्चा कोशिश कर रहा है but नहीं कर पा रहा है, it changes mindsets. Like now you have teachers saying, यार आप अगर पहले आ जाते तो मैं ये सब लोगों का बदल देती. In higher ed, we are seeing universities, like 3 years ago, IITians would say like, please, in लोग को, like not going to happen. Now we have the IIT, some of the top IITs coming and working with us to say, how do I get myself ready, because I want this mind in my classroom.
Yeah.
Right? You have people in the workplace who are sort of on the fence trying to figure out how do I get them, because one of the challenges, these kids will get bored, they don't get appreciated, they quit.
Yeah.
High unemployment and high turnover unless given that environment, which is experimental, all of that. And that's what we're trying to solve. Also, we are not trying to solve it in a silo. Like, that's not what we want to do. That's not the mission that our family set us up for. It's not the worldview we grew up with.
Correct.
कि तुम अपना देख लो और दुनिया देखती रहेगी. That is not what it is. It's always been that larger push.
Actually, our family has always been oriented from what is the impact you're doing outside more than the impact that you're doing internally. So our mindset is always, अच्छा उसको क्या ठीक कर सकते हैं, अपना तो हो जाएगा. What is that impact that you can make outside? And I think that's what's driving a lot of the decision making and the opinions that we have today.
I think for us, it's really about how you act for dyslexia. Our initial years went in how do you speak for dyslexia, right? Like how are you making people aware about this? Now we are at the phase कि बहुत बातें होगी, अब काम करो, right? We are at that tipping point that's happening. And from that perspective, I think we have like I would say a cross sectoral perspective. One is our focus is on an individual's life journey from cradle to career. So the idea is that I will not focus on one aspect of a person's life, but create that overall environment that the individual's life is smooth as they transition. Because, like with us, we have seen that growing up. We are seeing all of that. With my daughter also, I'm seeing that her challenges in school, very different as she's getting ready to go to college. And like the world is also changing. So that whole bit. But zooming out to say, I will not do individual level. That's not my role. I have many people in the system who are already touching this individual. But how do I empower that system that individual, he or she is going to walk through? Becomes that space. So what does that translate into? How do I sort of work on the early identification? अगर पता ही नहीं है, right? Like what was the transition point in Kunal's life? Being able to get the diagnosis and then get the support.
Yeah.
What was the thing for my kid and me, right? Like, she got the formal diagnosis. I could have kept going with without the formal diagnosis, but it changed the way she was sort of got the support. I think that whole bit, and everybody plays different roles in that identification process. So that's one bit they're working on. The second is large focus is always on remediation. स्पेलिंग नहीं आती है यार, इसको ना स्पेशल एजुकेटर के पास भेज दो, लैंग्वेज करा दो, फोनिक्स एंड सिलेबल्स कर लेंगे, राइट? और इट विल बी कि ये सब्जेक्ट नहीं है, ट्यूशन टीचर दे दो या टेक्नोलॉजी दे दो. दैट होल पीस अबाउट हाउ डू यू इंश्योर, I would say, ensure support. But the larger piece that works in almost anybody's life, if you see they've been successful, is that bit that they got avenues to unlock their potential.
Yeah.
And get that positive reinforcement in the one or two things that they did very well.
Yeah.
And pathways to sort of succeed in that. So how do you balance that through the person's life? So I think that's the second piece that we work towards, which then addresses school, it addresses special education, it addresses university, getting ready for employment, the whole employability piece. It works around getting quality education, accommodation, support, all of that bit. So that's the second sort of larger problem that we are trying to solve for. And then the third bit is, okay, now I've become an adult, I got all this great stuff. Iska bhai karu kya? Like how do I get that into the next person, the next job that they'll get? Will they be establishing their own enterprise? How do I do success? So I remember this was transitional for me, right? Like I went to a workshop as a parent advocate and I was saying, did you know that the world's, they're so good at spatial reasoning and, they make the world's best architects. And there was this thing around the Millennium Dome being built by a person with dyslexia and like how top architectural firms around the world are actively looking for this mind, right? And this mum was there in this workshop and she turned around and said, like, stop talking crap. My child can't do math, they're not going to clear the architecture exam, SPA में नहीं जा पाएगी, वो कहाँ architect बनने वाली है, तुम लोग ये बकवास करते हो इसीलिए हमारे life में problem होती है. And that was devastating for me. Like, I was an adult with a child of my own and I'd never heard this perspective in my life.
Yeah.
Ki a parent was giving up. But that is a reality. And to be honest, it is, right? Like that's how Madras Dyslexia Association, if I'm not mistaken, came up with. The parents decided their child wanted to do. Their son actually never went to architecture school. Today he lectures at the architecture colleges because he's this spatial designer and does all of this bit. So that's the dichotomy of, and we're trying to break that. That no matter what, it builds in. So one is the pathway of the child. The second is the ecosystem. And then the third is the stakeholders who can influence it. So like if I'm sort of looking bigger picture, who are those people?
Yeah.
I can say it's only teachers, can't work. It has to be government. Policy, implementation, because ultimately they are the only people who can scale. They're struggling with this as much as us. Very easy to say, Sarkar kuch nahi karti hai. But this is a real problem that's discussed and sort of is being trying to solve for. Then comes the employers, comes the parents, comes the friends. So who are those key stakeholder groups that we can work with? Now in all things dyslexic, we often get feedback कि तुम लोग बहुत कुछ कर रहे हो, समझ में नहीं आ रहा है ये क्या है, you're spread so thin. Or then the reverse is, इसको करने के लिए कितने करोड़ों रुपए चाहिएंगे. Then like my dad, the accountant, will come in. How will you sustain this? Where are the resources? Where's the expertise? All of this. And somehow at ChangeInkk, we figured this out, right?
Or it's still figuring it out.
Yeah.
But the point is, you still have to keep at it.
Correct. And I would say the word is leverage. How instead of looking at the picture of impacting this person to do it, you look at leverage of how you can maximize the impact. And having the patience to believe that it is a step-by-step process, right? Behavioral change is not going to happen overnight. So it has to start with thought process. then awareness when I'm thinking about it, I've shifted my mind. Then it has to be like, okay, I'm going to create the capacity, I'm going to create the policy enabling environment. Then I'm going to give them the tools to sort of build it out. Then I'm going to sort of force them to act. And I think we're at that space now over the last 3-4 years. Of course, in the background of work that has happened over the last 25 years in this country, from a lot of the field advocates, all of that, coming together and playing that convening role. And I think that's the journey. We're trying to do the difficult thing with the real intent of bringing, not easy. I'll tell you, it takes an emotional toll on you. But at the end of the day, when you see that champion arrive, like, you know, in Bihar, when we started, किसी के बॉस ने किसी को बोला कि ये ट्रेनिंग करवानी है, तो एक ट्रेनिंग हो गई, देन सेकंड ट्रेनिंग हुई, देन टीचर्स का फीडबैक आया, देन जिसको बोला था करवाने के लिए, बिकॉज इट वाज अ मैंडेट, सडनली ही इज लाइक, अच्छा अब आप लोग मत आना, मैं ट्रेनिंग करूँगा, right? And then the third time that transition happened, where now the person who was resisting, or the nodal officers, now become a champion speaking this language and doing it. Then he's becoming your champion and pulling you in all of it. And then of course, as any non-profits, right, like you get pulled up कि तुमने life में किया क्यों, ये basis पे क्यों हुआ, all of that. And that person saying that no, we have holistically looked at it.
Yeah.
This is not a personal agenda. And you know, for me in 3 years, that conversation with the TCF's team which said, Noopur is changing is Noopur. Like, this is a family-run business. To become an institution and an organization with a professional team that is sort of approached to solve this problem, right, is, I would say, my first step or the first milestone that we've achieved.
Correct.
And I have to call my team on it, right? Like, we have a lot of neurodiverse individuals within our team who drive us. We have a lot of young, committed people who are honestly trying to make that change, to make it happen, who work in difficult situations. Also, if you remember our first training we did in Jamui. Oh my God, everybody told me like, you're a fool. Like, Bihar जाकर कौन काम करेगा? वो भी तुम Jamui. And like, why don't you do this in Delhi, right? You'll be able to. And for me, it was, ki if I can do it in the most difficult place, and if it works for that unskilled teacher, in that under-resourced school or environment, and what I'm saying makes sense and associates there, then बड़े स्कूलों में तो हो ही जाएगा.
Yeah.
And sort of coming in that, and we've been lucky that, of course, a lot of it is self-funded in the family, but we have these
Supporters
and donors who've come in and given us that flexibility to experiment, to learn, to expand, both to set up the institution and to look at it in a holistic way, right? I think that has really sort of helped. Like, we now have a board, which we never thought. So that बड़ा काम करो, सही से कहो, big picture देखो. I think as kids of the family, we're no longer kids, but in our heads still, right? Sort of resonates, keeps us going. And from that sense, I think now we are ready to push the system to act for dyslexia.
I think she's hit the nail on the head. The real key is impact. Start small and keep chipping away at it. And I think that's what she's been really, really able to do and execute with her team.
Ultimately, where we as a community and a culture come together to ink this change, to act for dyslexia, right? Like, I think that's what ChangeInkk is all about.